Welcome, everyone. So good to see everybody again today. This is the last speaker series this year. So, hey, we did really well, I think. We had a lot of really good speakers. And that's one thing I wanted to mention. If anyone has a good idea for next year, some thoughts about who you'd like to see talk, or somebody from the island or not, just let me know and we'll see what we can do. Good afternoon and welcome also to the Zoom people. It is with great appreciation that we, the residents of Protection Island, acknowledge this land as the unceded territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation and of their legacy throughout the island. Thanks to Emily for all your hard work this season, and Marlene, who is away today, but will be back next year for sure. She told me she was. And this talk is being recorded. Emily will let us know in a day or two when it's available. Questions at the end, please. Zoomers, use the chat box or raise your hand so we can see it, and mute yourselves until the end. Donations will go to the Kootenay Lake Historical Society. Right, okay. And last week, donations of $40.90 went to Nault. Kitchen inspection was successful, as you know. However, the dishwashers are broken down. So it's being repaired, and hopefully by next year it'll be fixed. Okay. All right. And now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Robert David Turner. Bob was born in Victoria and attended UVic, obtaining a BSc in geography. He tells me during the program he was having a real problem with physics, and a young friend who was also at UVic and who he had met in grade 10 stepped up to the plate and offered to help him. He passed, and on graduation, he married her. Her name was Nancy. Next, they both went to UBC, where Bob obtained an MSc in regional planning and took a job in 1973 as regional manager in planning for BC Parks in Victoria. In 74, he moved over to the BC Provincial Museum, working on various projects, one namely the Provincial Museum steam locomotive with exhibits inside the train. And he eventually went on to become Chief of Historical Collections there and a heritage consultant. In this capacity, he has been the volunteer historian for the SS Moyie in Kaslo for over 40 years and has developed a special interest in historic steam vessels and transportation history as well. 19 of his books have been published, some of them which are over there. Just amazing how anyone could write beautiful books like that. Several more are in preparation as well, thousands of photos. 5 of his books are about stern whalers in British Columbia, Yukon, and Alaska. His research and photography have taken him to dozens of countries, to name a few: Burma, India, Syria, Europe, UK, Zimbabwe, Cuba, and Argentina. And there are many more. It would stretch right down to the wall there if I told you everything. He received an honorary doctorate degree from Simon Fraser University in 2022. And when he retired from the museum in 93, the title of Curator Emeritus was bestowed upon him. Bob and Nancy have been part-time and now full-time residents of Protection Island since 2009. They have 3 children scattered about North America, all doing amazingly well in their own fields, and 6 grandkids. Bob says he doesn't have much spare time, but you may see him each day walking Sally, their beloved lab, around PI. Please welcome Robert David Turner.
Thank you all for coming. Gosh, that was very sweet. Thank you, Bev. And well, as you know, my physics teacher there is also a brilliant book editor, and I'd be lost with my bad typing without her. When I was in the history department at the museum, I could claim to be the second fastest typer in history because I could touch type. In grade 12, you couldn't take home ec, which is I really wanted to take cooking, but I said no. But you can take typing. It was actually much better because it enforced discipline that cooking wouldn't in the same way. Anyway, Nancy has gotten me through lots of garbled pages in my books and in many other projects. So, and I'm having trouble with my ears. So Nancy, if you have some questions, will help me be my ears. I was hoping to find an ear trumpet, but couldn't find any in Walmart. So um this is the Moyie is a 1898 paddle steamer that was built by the CPR in Nelson. And that was in 1898, the time of the Klondike Gold Rush. And she was originally going to go to work on the Stikine River and what was to be an all-Canadian route up to the Klondike. And that fizzled. And the ship was still in pieces, and they diverted it along with the sister ship to the Kootenays. And the Moyie went into service in December 1898. And for the next 57 years, she served all of the communities around Kootenay Lake. And I have to point out, I should have said this sooner, Roger is with us today, which is really delightful. And Roger, as a young lad, remembers the Moyie when he was brought up in Nelson for that time.
6 years old.
No.
Wow.
And that's so I'm so happy you can be here. You can make sure I don't wander too far off track. And I'm doing it already. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were in touch with the mom of one of Nancy's students, of course, who rode on the Moyie on her last trip in 1957 when she was 6 years old and his sister was 8. They're living in up around Salmon Arm. So I got a lovely little quote from her about the last trip, which is just delightful. Anyway, if we keep going on like that, we'll be serving supper. And Annie will not, or Sally will not be happy with us. Over this 40 years or so that I've been looking into all of this, one of the people I met was David Webster, who was a chief steward in charge of personal passenger services, the dining room, staterooms, and so on. And he referred to the Moyie as the sweetheart of the lake, of Kootenay Lake. And that really summed up a lot about her story. So it's kind of a love story, Cinderella story around this old steamer. This shows her in 1947, and she still had a decade to go. It's typical Western paddle wheeler with the stern wheel at the stern, and very narrow or shallow hull. She could get into places in 2 or 3 feet of water, and freight deck with the boiler for the steam engines and the steam engines aft end. Then a passenger deck, more staterooms, the pilot house up in the top, and then the tall chimney. The construction of these boats was very lightweight, and the equivalent of a 2x4 or a 2x6 in a house on Protection Island, the equivalent on the Moyie in her cabins would be something like a 1x3. So when I first visited the Moyie and started walking down the decks, you could feel, but that was typical because they were trying to save as much weight as they possibly could so they could get into shallow water and make beach landings and so on. And for river service like the Stikine, that was really important. So she carried that through for the rest of her career. It does make restoration somewhat challenging. Well, just in case anyone hasn't spent a lot of time in the Kootenays or know where Kaslo is, I popped in a CPR map of the time. And well, Kaslo is just about in the center without me scrambling over there. This is Kootenay Lake on my side of the map, the Columbia River on the other side, this is before the Columbia River dams were built. So a lot of the foreshore on the Columbia was flooded and the Arrow Lakes. So this is pretty mountainous country, but this is where the sternwheelers thrived. These are hull dimensions. She's a big boat, 161 feet plus the paddle wheel, which was 19 feet in diameter, 30 feet across, hull depths of 5.1 feet, but that takes you up to the deck. The part below the water was, depending on cargo and everything, about maybe 2 feet typically. Tonnage, 834. You don't need to remember those. Tonnage is not a weight, it's a measurement of space within inside the boat. It's one of the funny features of maritime terminology. Now, this is where I get into trouble, not for any lack of sincerity, but the Tanaha, the Sinith. Now, if I get too far off the mark, Nancy can correct me. And the Sinith?
Theo, Sinith, and Tanaha.
Thank you. Nancy has a much better ability to speak in the languages of the first peoples, and I'm never quite able to do it the way she does. The story of the Moyie would be very different without the Kootenay Lake Historical Society, and the boat is the National Historic Site of Canada now. When a lot of the work that was done since she was saved from being after retirement was helped with Parks Canada, libraries, community museums. This is where we found out a lot of the information about her, and various funding agencies and donors. And it's been 3 generations now at Kaslo that have been looking after the Moyie. And it's an amazing way of bringing the community together and as a community resource. That's my good friend Ken Butler, who will speak about later. He's my buddy from the boat for many years. And it's amazing how many people and how many hours go into something like this. And as I know here, Beacon House is another example of a project that takes a lot of time and community involvement. But we figured that probably 350 people have worked on the boat seasonally. There have been dozens of people who have served on the board, sometimes different subsequent generations, the same family. It's created a lot of local employment. And one of the things we've tried to do very much is job training and skills development. It's hard to do anything on a large scale without funding, which always makes me think of Scrooge McDuck. And so I couldn't resist putting him in, one of my favorite Disney characters. But over the years since 1957, we've gotten wonderful support from many community organizations, human resources programs. We've had people start and go through to get their trades papers, journeyman papers in carpentry and various other of the building trades by working on the Moyie. So we've had some very skilled people supervising. There are 4 other sternwheelers in Western Canada that have survived. The Sycamoose at Penticton, which I'm sure some of you have seen. The Samson 5 at New Westminster was a snag boat on the Fraser, and she's preserved at New Westminster. She was running up into 1981. The Moyie isn't pictured here, but the Klondike at Whitehorse is part of the National Historic Site. And much like the Moyie, in a sense, she's become very much a symbol of the community. And the Keno up at Dawson, in a very similar way, is one of the Parks Canada vessels that tie into the whole gold rush history of Dawson City. These are all, by the way, much younger than the Moyie. One of the people who was very much involved with the early days of paddle wheelers in British Columbia was James True. He grew up on the Columbia at Portland, and his father was very much into local steamboat work. And he moved to British Columbia in the 1890s to the Kootenays, and then later to the BC Coast Steamship Service based in Victoria. But he was quite a brilliant ship designer, and has left quite a mark. Anyway, Troup designed and ordered 12 steamers to work on the Stikine for that gold rush service, but only 4 of them ever worked on the Stikine. The whole notion of that as a route to the Klondike fell apart very quickly in 1898. So the CPR backed out and sold off most of the boats, and that's why we have the Moyie with us in Kootenay Lake, because they were able to divert her hull and machinery there for construction. Troup had wanted to name the steamers on the Stikine, the dozen boats, with Tultan names. After talking to Mr. Calbreth, Frank Calbreth.
John Cal.
Thank you. Yes, the connection there is that his great granddaughter, Judy Thompson, was one of Nancy's students, of course, and a Dosti.
Very woman.
Yes.
From her.
And so I found out a lot more about the Calbreth family through Nancy's connection with Judy. And he had talked to Troup, but the CPR management preferred to name the dozen boats after miners, not miners so much, but surveyors, prominent people in the Yukon like Dawson, George Dawson. But the Moyie hadn't been christened yet, so they named it instead after the city of Moyie on Moyie Lake, which is hardly anything there anymore. So the Moyie and the Minto were the 2 exceptions in their names, but this was the Ogilvy, which was going to be up on the Stikine. And several of these boats eventually ended up on the Yukon River. They were sold off. Anyway, the Moyie story starts in 1898 when she was assembled at the Nelson shipyard of the CPR. And that's a picture of Bill Curran's father and other, tell you about Bill later, shipbuilders working on the decking of one of the boats. The bottom right-hand picture is the Moyie being launched at the Nelson shipyard with the Kokanee, an earlier boat, just offshore to make sure she didn't float down to the waterfalls a little downstream. Worse things have happened. The Moyie was used in December 7th, 1898, for a special excursion for the opening of the new railway from southern Alberta through the Crow's Nest Pass to the southern end of Kootenay Lake, and later extended through into the Boundary District and on. But this was a free excursion for the business types, local chambers of commerce, and so on. And that was the Moyie's major first trip. She was used on an excursion to Kaslo in the next May Day for the Knights of Pythias. And this is a very typical Moyie excursion picture. And with the decks just crowded with people, there was a legal limit to how many they could carry. And at this time, I think it was around 250. But everybody came out on deck for a picture, of course. She served that route until 1906 and then went into other services. I love this little postcard because it says the SS Moyie, Mogie, instead of Moyie. But it really does capture the Mogian service. This is another view of her at Nelson, with a goodly crowd. People dressed up for travel in those days. The ladies were well dressed. The men would wear suits. When the Duke of Connaught, who was Queen Victoria's son, came to British Columbia on a tour in 1912, the Moyie was used as their accommodation and tour vessel on Kootenay Lake. So the Duke of Connaught was the Governor General of Canada at that time, and Princess Patricia, their daughter, was a very popular and figure in the press and with the public. A very nice young woman, and she became very much involved as a figure in the Canadian military, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, which played an important role in both of especially World War II, I guess. Anyhow, as other boats were built, the Moyie spent more time on excursions, and this is another shot of people going on board with youngsters and people taking picnic baskets. They would go to a nice beach area or another community. There would be games and events and picnics, and dance trips as well. So it was a way for people to get to know each other. And most people didn't have cars in those days, right up into the 30s. So it was a great way for young people to meet each other. A lot of love affairs started on the excursions. So it led to a long history of, what can I say, public involvement and being very important to the communities, just like our little ferries. We can't do without them. But as the decades passed, of course, more and more people did get cars, roads were improved, and it became harder and harder to justify running the paddle steamers. Moyie pushed a lot of railway barges up and down the lake as well. That one is on the top. There's a complete train with a steam locomotive and caboose, and go from Nelson or Proctor up the lake to Kaslo and Lardo at the northern end of the lake, bringing carloads in, much like the railway barge still comes into Nanaimo from the Fraser River for the CPR. This was a long tradition. Anyway, looking at what might have happened had the people of Kaslo not saved the Moyie. And one of the places I've spent quite a bit of time is an abandoned shipyard across the Yukon River from Dawson City. And this one on the left is the Schwatka. Now, I took this picture 40 odd years ago, and since that time, it's totally collapsed. The boat was brought up out of the water by 1920 and stripped of useful equipment, not to mention windows and doors. That's was on board what the one next to it looked like, the Julia B. The Minto, which had been running on the Arrow Lakes, was eventually pulled ashore for a time. But then when the hydro dams were put in, the Moyie was towed offshore.
The Minto. The Minto was.
Thank you. I've told you about Nancy's good proofreading. And the Minto was burned in a very spectacular fire. When the Minto, the Moyie was going to be retired in 57, a very small group of people in Kaslo got together and decided they were going to do their best to save the boat. One of them was Jack Morris, who was also a mayor of Kaslo, and they formed the Kootenay Lake Historical Society. And they were able to persuade the provincial government to provide a few $1,000s for funding. And they bought the Moyie for $1 from the Canadian Pacific Railway. Now, they were able to pull her up on shore. They brought the winches from the old shipyard and towed her out of the water to get her above the high water mark at Kaslo, and put her on a frame that they made out of old railway trestles that they salvaged the lumber. This was really a working from scratch kind of organization, and they did an amazing job of getting the boat safely ashore, and that's the way she was for the next 20 years, 30 years. And serving as a community museum, and a lot of community artifacts were put on board and on display. That's kept the Moyie alive, I think is the best way to look on it. Some changes were made that were, in a sense, destructive, but they were repairable. But by 1988, the 80s, it was pretty clear that the Moyie was structurally in trouble and needed some pretty serious work. And on the structure, on the hull, the cradle that it was sitting on was deteriorated. The hull was hogging and bending. So they organized a fundraising campaign. Parks Canada, because it had become a National Historic Site, had an engineering crew go in and look at the structure, design a cradle for her to sit on. And I got dragged into this by Rick Stewart, who was a historian with Parks. He came to me and asked me if I knew anybody who would like to work on a structural history of the boat. And I thought about that was for how long? 5 seconds, son? I got a leave of absence from the museum and worked on that, then I was hooked. And this is a view of the foredeck. You can see it had deteriorated really badly. So it was a big job, but we learned lessons as we went through it. And one of the things I mentioned in the caption here was that we used to think it would be so nice if we had enough money just to do everything now and get it done. But we realized as the years went by that that really wouldn't have been the best outcome, that we needed to learn more about the boat, the way it had been built, and what we should do, so that we learned as we went along. One of the things that was very helpful was talking to the old shipwrights who had worked on the boats when they were operating. And I had the pleasure of getting to know quite a few of them who had been there from early in the century, pre-World War I in some cases. This is something Nancy and I have both felt so lucky about in what we've been doing, is spending time with many people from those earlier generations with a knowledge base that's very different from what you have today, and about how things were done, why they were done that way, and so on. So I've mentioned the state of work that was needed. This is pictures on board, I should say, are very unusual, partly because most people didn't have cameras, and if they had cameras, they were little Kodak roll film box cameras that just weren't suitable for taking inside pictures in a very fairly dark place. So this was the ladies' cabin at the back of the boat, which had once been a very beautiful room, and it had been allowed to become a day room, and carpeting had been replaced with battleship lino. The upholstery had largely been taken out, and a lot of decoration and stuff had disappeared. Other parts of the boat were made into museum displays like this one. And there wasn't really anything wrong with the displays, it's just that it was hiding the boat that was the National Historic Site. The displays could have been almost in a nice museum building. But before we could do a lot of the work, all of that stuff had to be removed carefully. And it required a lot of structural work to deal with leaking decks. One trip I made there, before getting totally involved, I went through the boat with Roy Green, who was former mayor of the city, and he was removing buckets and pots and pans from all over the deck where water was coming through. So he dumped the water, and I helped him and got to some idea of what was actually involved with keeping the Moyie alive. Anyway, we were able to replace the cradle with a steel cradle, and that shows her it just as it was being finished. And that's still in service. And so we had Parks Canada Engineering and Dick Smith, who has built boats for Kootenay Lake from steel, built the steel cradle for Moyie. We also put in a fire suppression system, and this was one of the best investments we could possibly make. And this is another family story. We were up there with a couple of the girls. This is pre-Kate, I think. Anyway, we often did our field work with the kids, which was lots of fun. Anyway, the Tushai was one of the White Pass and Yukon boats that was pulled out of the water and was being worked on by Yukon Parks at Carcross. This was in 1982 when I took that photo at the top, and really a lovely boat. When we were coming home from Kaslo, just after the fire suppression system had been tested, got a phone call from my mom who said one of the boats is burned up. And it was the Tushai. It had caught fire, perhaps from arson, perhaps from people camping on board or under the hull, lighting a campfire. No one really knew, but she was gone to this state in 2 hours. There was no controlling it. And 2 other boats were lost at Whitehorse in the same way. So then with the fire suppression system installed, we went ahead with repairs to the decks and the cabins. This is one of my favorite pictures. That's Nancy Wakefield, who's been a good friend for a long time. She was working on the upper deck, and she was there as an apprentice carpenter. Went on to be on the board of the society for many years and is still very much a friend of the Moyie. She like as I do, think of the Moyie as a living being, not just a jumble of old wood. That this vessel has a personality, that has a way of getting a hold of you, and that's why she was the sweetheart of the lake. It wasn't just Nancy Wakefield and Bob that had this notion. Dan Pasemko, carpenter, my friend Ken Butler, putting in a traditional scarf joint, not trying to follow the original building practice of the boat as much as we could. Anyway, Nancy, she was working on the upper deck, and I looked up, and there were people down below, and I heard her shriek, "Don't you dare put any staples in my fascia board," which shows how much the project, how important it was for her, and I applauded that. But we really wanted to make the boat come alive, and this meant not just structural restoration and returning museum objects that, World War I machine gun really didn't belong on the Moyie. So we spent a lot of time interviewing people, looking at photographs, and trying to see what she was like in earlier days. Bill Curran, who in the 80s and 90s was on the board, had worked as a fireman on board, and his father had been shipyard foreman at the McCusk shipyard. And so there was lots of information bubbling around, but what's the most reliable? Well, if we could prove that it happened on the Moyie, or we could find evidence, that was really what we wanted. If it happened on the Minto, which was her sister ship, or the Tyrrell, that was getting pretty close. And then if it happened on other boats that were operated by the CPR, well, that was 8 out of 10, or maybe 7 out of 10. So that was all we could do. That would be the best we could do. If it happened elsewhere on the CPR, if it was typical CPR passenger services, that was good. But we never tried to ask, what do we think would be nicest? Or, gee, wouldn't it be prettier if we did it this way? That wasn't a consideration, because it wouldn't be returning it to its original character. So these are some of the other boats. And of course, photographs where we could find them helped a great deal. I've got way too many photographs in the household. We're transferring over 100,000 digital images at home. We're able to get some information from the boats in the Yukon, and I won't go into that a lot of detail, but Ken and John Pollock and I spent quite a bit of time in the abandoned shipyard at Dawson, finding out stuff. Now, this is one of my favorites. This photograph was originally published or printed about that big as part of a Christmas card by the officers of the Moyie in 1902. And you think that's a pretty crummy picture, isn't it? But it's surprising what you can tell. And I have a print, which I'll pass around. But we were able to bring out a little bit of the details. And this is the only picture we have of the ladies' cabin on the Moyie in these early days, really before the 1950s when it was preserved. But what this tells us, it gives us an idea of the ventilating panel behind the officers that are standing, the decorations in the corners that you can barely see there. And also, if you look at closely, there's pinstriping on the walls. When we got to working on the details of the cabin, under several layers of paint, we could find that pinstriping. Enough to replicate it, that's really what I should say. But you could see where in the wood it had filled in, there was a line there, more than right next to it. Up in the corners, there was a plastered three-dimensional decoration in each corner, and it was repeated in some other places on the boat. But it was this photo that really told us what was there. We could see there was evidence of something being there. But if you look closely at the photo, the light's coming through the clerestory windows on each side, and you can see that it was three-dimensional. And that was a eureka moment. I'll pass it around. But we found in California a company that was still making this kind of plaster decoration. And so we did tracings of the original as best we could from what we could see from on the walls of the boat, and sent that down to the good folks of, I think they were in Sacramento, and had done work on restoring the state capitol buildings. But they sent us this big hamper full of plaster goo, and it has a roping pattern. There were floral features and things like that, and they were able to send us those. Used to be able to order them in catalogs for this kind of work. Anyway, Ken and Crystal Moon. Crystal is a talented artist in Kaslo and a longtime friend. Between the two of them, they were able to replace it on the walls of the boat. And then it was painted with gold leaf. And we wouldn't have really known what was there without that one tiny little photo. So it sort of shows you some of the process that gets involved in trying to get it right. This is the same story. The bottom photo shows the pattern that appeared with very careful sanding under 3 or 4 layers of paint. All of these decorations were taken out of the Moyie year about 1930, as far as I could pin it down. That top photo is an enlargement of the one corner of the one that we're passing around. That's what it looked like when it was finally reapplied to the boat after having been gone since the 1920s. And it was done in several other places. There's Crystal working on another decoration that was at the back of the ladies' cabin. You can see also some of the gold leaf stenciling we found under her elbow there to your right. And up on the top photo, you can just see the tracing of the pinstriping below the molding. And the next photos show what we could find with very careful sanding through generations of paint. A lot of it was lead-based paint, so crews working on it had to be properly suited up. We found lettering that was painted over. That one says ladies' toilet in capitals, and it was done in gold leafing as well. There was no heating on the boat. That's why Crystal is wearing a parka. A few years ago, this is one of my favorites. We received in the mail from Joanna Nagel a stencil from her great-great-grandfather, Alfred Johnson. That's what Ken and Bill Yo are holding, and it looks like smudged charcoal on a piece of paper. But what it has is dozens of little pinholes that were placed against the bulkhead of the ship and then dusted with charcoal. So it went through the little holes and transferred the original design onto the bulkhead. So we had done that, we had replaced that decoration without the benefit of the stencil. And we were quite delighted at how close it actually was. There were one or two minor differences, but it's so lovely to have this original stencil from the boat. And Alfred Johnson had also worked on the Empress Hotel with decorations there and on some of the CPR coastal boats. Anyway, these pieces started to come together, and we found in the ladies' cabin, under the backs of the seats, which had long been removed and reupholstered, some fragments of a plush red velvet fabric. And that, as far as we could tell, was original from 1898. So we had a project budget for this, and we spent the whole budget on the fabric, getting it brought in from Holland. And we had a wonderful local upholsterer in Kaslo. My name's gone. Anyway, she did the seats for us. We had a little question as to how soft they should be. So this being the ladies' cabin, several of the ladies at Kaslo had a little bouncing test, which was the most comfortable. We ended up having another fundraiser where the ladies of Kaslo could each sponsor a seat. And no, they all got the same softness. But anyway, that finished the room. We have this photo, which is from the Kokanee, and you can see the type of upholstery that was what we replicated. This helped a great deal. Don't have anything like this for the Moyie. We did find fragments of curtain fabrics down in the walls of the cabin. The glass windows full forward and dropped down into a kind of a cavity. And over the years, curtain ties had dropped down in there, along with what? Bubble gum, crayons, chicken bones, cigarette butts, all sorts of stuff. Kids' schoolwork and school books. That was really fun. And all in kind of a midden. Some of them were disturbed because people got a coat hanger and tried to fish something important out. But others were pretty much intact. But we also didn't want to destroy the walls of the boat. So we removed this sort of thing very carefully. And we have lots of possibilities for more archaeological work on the stuff. But it gave us a really good idea of what people were doing on the boat. When it would take 4 or 5 hours for a day trip very often. She normally didn't go much more than 10 or 12 miles an hour. So it was a leisurely travel. And if you were there with some 6-year-old kids, you'd be somewhat stressed keeping them happy. So it helped with all that sort of human side of the story. My mom, who was a very good seamstress, did a lot of the sewing, and so did Dot Morris, who was standing towards the back in the middle there. For these curtains. And by the time we were done, this is what the Moyie's ladies' cabin looked. And I'm always tickled with this photo. I'm going to have to hurry up. The other story about this is that the carpeting came from the Empress Hotel. Now, I didn't go in at night with a van, although it was tempting, but fortunately, and lots of stories about the boat have a fortunately involved. The Empress was replacing its really good carpeting in many of the hallways. But where it was worn was down the middle. And there was a lot of almost brand new carpeting on either side. So I was talking to the lady who was their outreach public relations person, and she was very helpful. And in the end, we were able to get the carpeting people to cut out the good stuff. And we rolled it up, and my friend Peter and I were able to borrow a museum van because we had some other stuff and deliveries to make, and take it up to Kaslo. And once again, our budget was exhausted, but we got it for virtually free. All we needed to do was pay for the cost of the people to cut out the good stuff. But the Empress said, you can have the rest. And they also gave us some carpet runners, which hadn't been used. This is a British-made Axminster carpet, which is the same style of amazingly tough carpeting that was used in the boats. We didn't have a sample of original 1898 carpet, but we really also didn't have the budget to get that custom made, as you can well imagine. But it always figured it did a good job. And that's showing some more of the stenciling that we found under the old paint. And so, well, we can skip that one just to move along. We wanted to help people step back in time as we sort of developed interpretive programs and so on, and not just be thinking, oh, that's an old thing, but to get the feel of what it was like to be traveling or to be depending on the boats 100 years ago. And so we were very careful to avoid things like computer screens with a copy on it. And we tried to keep things low key. We had recordings of piano music from the early 1900s because we have a piano on board. And so it wasn't playing 1970s jazz, it was playing something appropriate. And it gets tricky, what's typical of things that are done now? Well, duct tape, modern fastenings, it depends a lot on your working experience. If you see hex head screws in something, it wasn't done 100 years ago. They were slotted screws that were used. So where anything like that was visible, that's what we tried to do. We also introduced some sound into some of the cabins at a low key. This was kind of sweet. We got the board of the society and some of our workers to sit around in the ladies' cabin while we played a tape of childhood sounds with one of the cabins that was set up to be for a mother and a youngster. And we played a tape of a very fussy little kid. All of the grandparents and grown-ups started squirming. We then played one of a youngster giggling and cooing, and everybody seemed to relax immediately. So that was the one we chose to include. It's oh yes, here's some of the samples of I got to hear it myself for sure, of the curtain fabrics that we found down in the walls of the boat, where it had come together, where it looped around the hooks. It hadn't faded or anything. Pretty messy, but we could pick up the kind of pattern that was used. And we, again, couldn't get custom matching it, but we were able to come up with the best we could best we could make it. I remember one of our summertime students on board was very much into fabrics and sewing, and she was trying to convey that to visitors and so on, and say that fabric speaks to you. And she loved good fabric. It made me feel much better that we hadn't just gone to Walmart or something and gotten the cheapest thing we could and put it in. We'd scrounged and saved until we could get it the right way. Well, jumping ahead, a boat like this is like a house in the sense that it needs regular maintenance. And it was due for a lot of serious work by 2020 or so. Kit Ashenhurst and Daniel Belanger were the two leaders on the reconstruction work at this time. And we were able to pull together funding to work on the decks and work on the structural aspects of the cabins as well. They were starting to collapse, actually. And so this is the way she looked in 2022. And of course, we had to have a safe work site. So the difference between 1988 and 2022 is in the density of the scaffolding and everything on the site. This, of course, cost a lot more. But it did an amazing job. By this time, too, we had to redo much of the fire suppression system to bring it up to standard after almost 30 years. And yes. And I have to throw in a picture of my mom because she did a lot of work on the Moyie, living in Victoria. She made a new pennant based on an original one that was badly damaged. It was, about 6 feet long. And I got down on the floor and cut it out, and Mom sewed it. And so it's always fun to see it flying from the Moyie. And it's been wonderful to see her like this and to invite people on board. And she's really become a centerpiece of the community. And the present, Sarah, the present board chair, worked on the boat as a teenager or in her 20s going to school. And we've had other cases of 2 and 3 generation people being involved in the restoration work or serving on the board. If you can't get another younger generation interested in helping out, you're not going to be successful in preserving it in the long run. It's probably one of the most important things that a small organization can do. I'm not flogging books, but this one is coming out sometime this summer, I hope, from Harbor. Harbor's doing it, but I don't know quite the timing yet. So this has been fun to do because I was able to update my memory of various projects that have gone on. And this was the last voyage I got just the other day. Our parents, along with our maternal grandparents from England, were on the final voyage of the Moyie. Valerie was 8 and I had just turned 5. We both remember wearing pretty dresses and standing on the deck and watching the paddle wheel turn and the water churning. Valerie remembers the horn, which was a whistle, and the black soot covering our dresses. And during the summer months, our parents would take us to the beach. The memory, which remains very vivid and we recall to this day, are the very large waves that would wash ashore after the Moyie had passed. That's from the wash of the paddle wheel. We would patiently wait and then turn to jump the waves. Well, this is very sweet. We have, as I mentioned, Roger is a Moyie veteran from 6 years old.
6 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and remembers going on board on this narrow gangplank.
First, 1948. I remember going on the Moyie and being scared stiff My dad was driving up on two planks, he had to board the ship, and I'm sure the car was gonna fall in the water. But, and then I lived just blocks away later on in Nelson from where the Moyie was moored there for years. And I used to work at the Blue Top Motel in Nelson, which was just up from Kootenai Lake. So I've got a lot of fond memories of.
Oh, that's lovely. We're so glad you could be here today, Roger.
I am too.
And I guess I'll confess I didn't get permission from Disney to use it, but I'm sure Walt Disney wouldn't mind. Yeah, sure. Well,
Question.
See, we're big now.
I'm sorry. Would Moyie be seaworthy? We've often thought how lovely that would be. In practical terms, no. There are several reasons. The machinery is intact.
Say what the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Would the Moyie be seaworthy now? And unfortunately, no, it is our conclusion for several reasons. If you're going to carry passengers, she's not up to modern standards of life-saving and escape routes and all that stuff. So the decks, the companionways are narrow and the deck railings are too low. And so that would be a concern. But the hull would be a huge job. And it has steel frames, but it was planked with Douglas fir from the coast. And some of those planks were 40 feet long, 3 inches thick, and up to 14 inches wide. Try to find those at a Home Depot. And let alone bending them and shaping them and steaming them to get the curvature. It would be very difficult to do that. You'd end up probably putting a fiberglass or something around it. So, and in practice, no, it would do so much damage to the boat to make it floatable that we just concluded it wasn't the way to go. Yes, Lynn. Oh, okay. What were Moyie's engines like? She had two, one on each side, and they were a simple single expansion steam engine. So the cylinders are about that big wide in diameter, and they were connected with like a piston rod to a cam on the paddle wheel on each side. And the two of them were a quarter of a turn apart. So you could get a good even paddle, but you can see the wake that there was a power stroke there. It's hard to visualize. But that was typical. And the engines and the boiler were often the most valuable part of these boats. That if the hull was shot, they could move all the machinery into a new one, onto a new hull, and get another 10 or 20 years out of it. Typically, the boats seldom lasted more than 25 years, which makes the Moyie's 57 pretty impressive. A lot of them on places like the Yukon were lucky to last 10. So yeah, it was just a flat single expansion steam engine on each side that would go like this.
So there was a furnace in there somewhere.
Sorry?
There was a furnace in there to make.
Oh, at the front end was a steam boiler. In Moyie's case, she ran on coal. Most of the ones on the Yukon burn wood because the coal supplies there weren't very good. Some places they were oil fired later, especially later in their lives. But there was like a very similar boiler to what you find on a steam locomotive. 20 feet long, this big in diameter, with a big firebox where they would shovel in, say on a trip from Nelson to Kaslo and back, maybe 2.5 tons of coal.
Wow.
Yeah, it was fuel economy was important in those days, but it was measured differently. Yeah, they it was always a toss-up. If you got a more efficient boiler, then you could carry more cargo. But the more efficient boiler could be more expensive to maintain or to get to where you were building your boat. It was, but they got pretty good at that.
Thank you. Did you renovate the paddle wheel itself?
Yes. Did we renovate the paddle wheel? Yes, we did. It was all structurally intact, but there was a lot of rotten wood in it too. So there had sort of 2 cycles of working on the boat, one in the 90s and one about 2010, where some of the woodwork was replaced. The paddle box over the top was an interesting bit because, like just about everything on these boats, it was curved. The lumber wasn't just straight. Looking for a nice clean 2x4. They were often bent and so on. But one of the things we concluded that was tricky about the paddle box was that it wasn't meant to be waterproof. It was really meant to protect the upper decks from spray and the passengers, but it was getting water from underneath as well as on the top, so that the wood on the paddle boxes didn't last as long as a lot of other places. But they really weren't too concerned about that sort of thing. Can I say back in the good old days? Because they had a shipyard with experienced people. At times they'd have 50 or 60 people working in the shipyard. People who had put in 7 years maybe of apprenticeship and lots of experience. So a lot of it was done by eye and very limited engineering plans and drawings. So if you look at 2 boats that are supposed to be identical, one might be a couple of feet longer than the other. We found one neat spot in the roof of the ladies' cabin where, as far as we could guess, there had been 2 guys working on the scantlings, to call it, like the joists under the ceiling, because they'd started out being at the same point, but one of them had moved up 20 inches, the other had moved up maybe 21, and then 20, and then 22. So they were starting to get out of line. But if we looked at it carefully, then they got it straightened out again. They didn't take it down and start again because it didn't matter. But it was quite neat to see that the handwork that was there, it wasn't down to the centimeter or anything like that. It was very much done by eye and experience. You might not get away with that in a house being built today.
When did they, what year was it that you got a carp from the?
I'm sorry, what's the card?
What, the carpet?
Mhm.
From the Empress?
What year?
What year?
With the, that was, gosh, I'd have to check, but early 90s. Yeah, that was about right. Yeah, because I was at the museum until 93, and yes, thereabouts.
How did they steer the Russian?
Sorry, which?
How did they steer it?
Oh, steering. Yes. How did they steer? Well, like Mickey, there was a big manual steering wheel, wooden wheel, up in the pilot house, and it was connected with cables and down to the freight deck, back aft to the tillers just inside the stern, and then down below, outside the hull, there were 4 rudders that were tucked up, so they were, the bottom of the rudders was very close to the bottom of the hull, so that way they didn't get wiped out on rocks or anything. But it was quite interesting. It took a lot of leverage and muscle power to steer them. The bigger boats and the newer ones often had some hydraulic steering in them, which made it much easier. But the connection to the rudders was pretty much the same.
You talked about beaching on one of these excursions.
Mhm.
How do they get back off the beach?
Carefully. On the excursions where they did beach landings, how did they get off the beach? They were very skilled at it, and they usually would have some steel or thin metal on the bow of the boat to protect it from beach landings and also ice and stuff. So they would just reverse the paddle wheel and pull it off slowly. So they were pretty versatile. That was one of the reasons they could serve a lot of the little communities all along the lakes and rivers. So if there was an orchard and they had their apples ready to go in the Kootenays, they'd stick a flag out on the beach, and the Moyie or the other steamers would pull in, and you'd load it over the gangplanks onto the freight deck, and then she'd go off again.
Perfect. Great, thank you.
All of the amazing work and repair and regulations. Now that the ship is an historic site, does that make you feel comfortable that the ship is in good hands and that will be protected? Or is it up to the public still?
Thank you. How do we feel about the state of the Moyie into the future? Being a National Historic Site, that helps a lot, because they're very important to Canada's culture and heritage. Funding is always a challenge. And like I was saying, it's really important to keep a younger generation interested. But I also remember, I don't want to go on too long, but we had an event at the Moyie, and Corky Evans was a previous government's NDP. That was 2009, I think it was. He was a cabinet minister and an MLA from the Kootenays. And he said in a little speech he gave, which was very touching, he said, "I was wrong." Now, you don't hear that too often in the news. Yeah, and especially from some quarters. But he said, "I used to think tourism and heritage wasn't really worth the money because it was low-paid jobs and it's seasonal, and it wasn't like a good union job." Speaking as a good NDPer. But he said, the Moyie with Jack and Ken and various others had taught me that I was wrong. And he said, I realized that, here we were getting job training and skills development, and it was making a huge difference to the community. And I think I was very moved by that, and a lot of people were too. But it's easy for, if you go to polarity in politics, that if it isn't a union job, it's no good. If it isn't making a big profit, it isn't any good. That's the other extreme. And a lot of this is somewhere in the middle. And so we've worked to get broad support, and that's made a big difference. The funding that's often available for heritage projects won't support something that is just one topic. So if you want to have an old car museum, you're not going to get the same money as if you're dealing with the history of the Okanagan Valley or something like that. But with the Moyie, we've tried to make it have multiple stories there. And that's something we can continue to work on and need to. There's lots of neat avenues for research and so on to go on. There were Chinese cooks on the boats. I know the names of a few of them, but it would be really nice to know more of their story. Where they came from in China, for example, and there weren't many women working on the boats. During the wars, there were guess where? In the kitchen and in the dining room in service. There weren't any officers. So, it's a different time period. those are pretty good stories to develop. And we try and bring that sort of thing out, but it can take some serious digging to get the stuff that you want to be truthful and to bring it forward.
Where did she get her name from? It's an
Oh.
unusual name.
Yes, this is one we've talked about. Where did the Moyie's name come from? Well, this stretches me into French, but I mentioned that Captain Troop and Mr. Galbraith had talked about trying to get First Nations names for the boats, which in the end were named after explorers and surveyors in the Yukon. I never found out what the 12th name might have been for the Moyie. On one ad in the Stikine River Journal, I think it was, mentioned the Shaughnessy, which was the name of CPR at that point president. He didn't think that was a good idea. But I don't know, had the Moyie gone to the Klondike, what she would have been named. But the CPR was naming its boats after the developing cities in the Kootenays primarily, or the rivers. So there was a Nelson, there was a Trail, boats named that way. So Moyie was named, as far as I can tell, after what was then called Moyie City on Moyie Lake. And Moyie is from a French word for wet terrain, and there was a lot of wetlands in the southern part of Moyie Lake. So it's kind of a twisted story. If you go to Moyie now, it's just a very small community. But at that point, it was a big mine site. So it was, I think, essentially promoting the mining industry of the Kootenays at that time.
I'm really curious about this women's lounge. Ladies' lounge. What's the
Oh, yes. Well,
Okay.
the ladies' lounge.
But Guinea. Did it carry through into the 50s?
I don't know when formally it would have stopped. They typically had this type of very pleasant lounge with some of the staterooms on the outside, and it really was intended for women and children. And if you were a certified husband, you might be allowed in. But at the front end of the boat, there was the smoking room, and there was an area next to the bar, of course, for playing cards. And the sitting room, the smoking room had, as far as I can tell, linoleum down, didn't have carpeting, and spittoons placed strategically. And there was also a lovely velvet curtain that would draw across the ladies. The dining room was in between. So I don't know, it wasn't a cast in stone distinction. And from what we can find on the walls, that it probably disappeared by the 30s, effectively. As you say, somewhat sadly. Yes, Barry.
Was there anything left of the Rattenberry design dining room?
Sorry?
Was there anything left of the dining room?
Oh, the dining room.
Rattenberry design?
Sorry?
Did Rattenberry design?
Oh, I don't know that Rattenberry designed it. It would have come through Troop, and this Mr. Johnson probably doing the detailed design. But I know Troop hired Rattenberry to do design work on the coastal steamship Princess Victoria, and that was 1903. And he sent letters to CPR management saying that you had to get the details right to make the whole thing right. And he persuaded CP management that to use Rattenberry's interior decoration in the Princess Victoria. And I think he would have shown very similar intentions just 5 years earlier with Moyie, from everything I can tell. But that's the closest connection I have with them.
Was anything left of the dining room?
Oh yeah, was anything left at the dining room? That's yet another story, but the flooring was a hardwood parquet. This almost about that thick, hardwood carpeting it was sometimes called. But by the 30s, it was pretty worn and in tough shape, and it was covered with battleship linoleum, really beautiful dark brown or sort of a dark green. We had to remove that to do structural work, and we found all the carpeting, and we were able to save some of it, but we're also able to replace anything else. So it now has back to its original hardwood parquet. And the dining room originally had big plate glass windows on each side, 4 on each side. 2 of them were removed by, I think it was, well, I guess in the early 20s. And but the rest of it is pretty much intact. We have the original tables. Dining room service ended about 1930, but we've been able to get quite a bit of CPR china and stuff back, which is really nice. There were linen tablecloths and very complete silver service. No plastic for on the Moyie. Not quite. I shouldn't say BC Ferries, perhaps, but there's actually pretty good. With printed menus and quite a wide selection of dishes available, and all served very formally. There was a steward attached to each main table.
It sounds like it was a kind of a high class experience to go on this ship. Now, but those towns there were the miners and farmers. Those aren't exactly high class people who have a lot of money. How does that balance out?
There were this is what about the miners and the loggers and so on who are traveling on the boats compared to the people with lots of money? It could be an expensive trip, yes. There were signs in the boats that if you were wearing your cork boots, that you had to leave them down on the freight deck. That was one of the pursers and chiefs and stewards' jobs, was to pleasantly remind people to go down there. And there really wasn't a first and second class on these boats. On the Yukon boats, there were. But if you didn't have the money for overnight, you could sleep on the freight deck just with a bedroll. But this was why the smoking room up front was sort of the boys' turf with the spittoons, and there you could relax if you've been out prospecting for a couple of weeks. That's where you'd go. You could still get in the dining room. They wouldn't shove you out, but you'd be paying 50 cents or $1 or something for a meal. They were pretty reasonable in the early days, but salaries were so much lower. $1 there would be a good part of a day's wages for a lot of people. Gentlemen.
Just one quick thing I should say. I want to thank you. I've visited Moyie a number of times between the 80s and 90s. So I'm thanking you for the work you've done on that boat, because it's quite amazing. I recommend it to anybody that can go to the interior and take a look at that boat. Yeah. It's really worth it.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Yeah, sure. No, it's been a lot of fun. Yes.
So how many crew would been on the voyage?
How big was the crew? In later years, it was about a dozen people, because they didn't have the dining room services and stuff. In busy times, it would be more like 24 or something like that, with a captain, a second officer, chief engineer, second engineer, maybe a third, a couple of stokers, a couple of deckhands, and then a chief steward, a couple of cooks, and 3 or 4 stewards handling the dining room service, and also making up the staterooms and all that sort of thing. So it varied with the times and what service they were in.
Well, I was gonna say, I remember the Minto very well.
Oh, yeah.
Clearly, and I was curious to know what, because we used to swim around as kids at the dock where it landed in the late forties. What did they do with their sewage? Were we swimming in their sewage?
What was the sanitation like on the boat? There was a ladies' toilet facility and a men's toilet facility on the passenger deck. And far as I know, that just went into the lake. Some of the bigger boats had showers, and the drainage would be the same, I'm sure. The overnight cabins had chamber pots, and that was one of the jobs of the stewards. That also applied on the coastal steamships. They're about this big. They call them thunderbugs. But they were CPR standard with their crest, house flag on them, and they were usually in a mahogany case with a brass handle on the top. So it was handled discreetly under the berths or the bunks in the cabins, so that saved people having to go in their night attire to the other end of the bunk if necessary. If you were lucky, you weren't that far away, but it was the kind of the standard of the day. It was a different expectation. Yes.
Do you have any pictures or find any pictures of the cabins?
I'm sorry, which?
Cabins, what would they look like?
They're very hard to get pictures of, and I was kicking myself because I haven't taken any recently of them restored. I do have one, but I have lots of plans for them. Typically, they were about that wide with 1x3 walls and often a window. And some of them were entered from the outer deck, some from the inner deck. So there would be a corner washstand with a wash bowl. Many of them didn't have running water in the passengers, with a pitcher, and an upper and a lower berth. Some had a wider lower berth. They might be for a family, but wider means that wide for two people. And there would be a ladder or a stepping stool to help you get up to the upper berth. So they were very, very simple. I don't have many descriptions of people's travels on them, but I did get some lovely letters written by a school teacher from Minnesota originally. This is where eBay comes in handy. Got a package of letters she'd written home to her parents and was traveling on the Yukon, but the cabins were very much the same. And she just described them in some detail, and that it was good to have earplugs because the thin walls of something snore or anything like that could be hard to sleep. And some of them were right over the engines. And that could be challenging because they would run at night if they needed to, at least on a lake service. They wouldn't go through rapids at night, but yeah, very hard because it was the photography was the challenge to get any depth of field in a picture. But if anybody has any, I'd love to know.
In the restoration process of the money side of it, you talk about grants and fundraising. Was there any degree of corporate support, given that they had been run by the CP world? Was there corporate support for the reconstruction and restoration?
Corporate support. There was some, yes. CP had, I don't know if they still do or not, but they had a kind of heritage fund that you could apply for funding. But I think I wish they would do more. They've certainly been helpful with archival material and stuff like that. I think their challenge is that there are so many old railway stations and cabooses that might be a Chamber of Commerce place, and in railway museums with rolling stock and so on, that they're they don't want to be in a position of funding all of those, or be, I don't know what level of responsibility. It kind of depends on, I guess, their profit and loss for that year. So I would love to see them more, but they've always been supportive, but it hasn't been with $1 million checks or anything like that. And I can kind of understand their position. CP had a very small corporate archives, and they've transferred a lot of that to the Railway Historical Society in Montreal, and Canadian National stuff went to the public archives. But it's been more funding more through heritage funds from the province or the feds, or job creation programs or summer student programs, that sort of thing. And also private donors as well. They've been very, very gracious and generous. Well, thank you.
Thank you.